Welcome back to the Legacy Radio Network. This is Dennis Tubbergen, your host. This is the Everything Financial Radio Show, and we are chatting with Mr. Dan Kennedy. Dan is a prolific author, business consultant. Dan, if someone wants to learn more about your work or learn a little bit more about or read your political commentary, how would they go about finding you?
If they're interested in the politics, they can go to businessandmedia.org. If they're interested in books, the website is nobsbooks.com, nobsbooks.com, and general information about our organization for entrepreneurs and seminars and conferences and newsletters and so forth is all accessible at dankennedy.com.
Hey, Dan, tell us about your latest project. I know we're interrupting you today. You mentioned you're finishing up a book. What are you working on?
Just finishing another book in the No BS book series on marketing to boomers and seniors for both good and bad, economically and societally. We, of course, are in the midst of a age wave in America, and surprising to some people, the wealth, the discretionary spending, spending activity is all heavily weighted into the 50 to 65 and 65 to 80 age frames. And many companies are aggressively shifting efforts. IKEA, for example, which has long lived off of what I would call starter furniture, where the bulk of their customers are just moving out of mom and dad residences and into their own apartments and into first homes, and are buying fairly inexpensive IKEA furniture. IKEA is aggressively moving into the downsized senior market and creating product and advertising and marketing campaigns aimed at them. And that's sort of representative of a lot of what is going on. And so I've done books in the past on marketing to the affluent, for example. And so this book, which will come out very late this year or early in 2013, is all about the boomer and senior marketplace.
Dan, love to shift gears here just a minute and go back to your economic forecast, because you had mentioned excessive regulation, although I'm not sure you use those terms. And we do a segment here on the Everything Financial Radio Show called Big Government Files. We, for example, on this week's show just talked about the fact that the food police in Los Angeles County obtained a list of people that obtained, legally I might add, natural milk, unpasteurized milk, and they decided to go door to door to confiscate this illegal organic substance. It wasn't even grown under lights. So when you look at this excessive regulation, what would be the correct policy response? And, you know, depending on what happens in November, and I'd like to get your political views here in just a moment, what would be the correct policy response?
Well, you know, you've put your finger on really two sort of regulatory issues. One is federal overreach beyond states' rights, which even ultra-liberal Representative Barney Frank has chosen to object to the federal interference again in the state of California with their legal medical marijuana laws and an ongoing federal attack on that industry. And, you know, I mentioned the agricultural thing where the EPA is busily trying to regulate the amount of dust that a farmer can have on his farm, and the Labor Department has made an attempt at essentially outlawing family farmers' employment of their own children. God forbid the kids should learn how to get up in the morning and work and sock some money away into their college fund rather than accumulating $100,000 worth of debt just to get through college. If you look at all these businesses and all these industries, and you look at federal overreach to states' rights and you look at federal interference with the businesses and all the way down to the kind of thing with the milk that you just identified, where government is going to go beyond being a nanny state into micromanaging every little detail of our lives and interfering with commerce between consumer and vendor. I mean, the correct approach, of course, is to get out of the way of innovation and enterprise as much as possible. I mean, obviously, some level of regulation is necessary in every industry. Much of what already exists, of course, is not being successfully deployed and enforced. So while piling on new burdensome rules and regulations, many of which never require approval by Congress, let alone voters, they're done by fiat, by regulatory agencies and presidential directive. We ought to be successfully enforcing those regulations we already have in place, or if they are unenforceable, fixing them. And B, we ought to be getting out of the way as much as is humanly possible without compromising basic consumer safety and consumer rights of business, because it is the small and mid-sized company that is both the generator of jobs, the generator of good middle-class jobs, and the a generator of capital. And when you make it so burdensome that I recall the CEO of Carl's Jr. Restaurants being interviewed about essentially stopping opening restaurants in California and redirecting efforts to expansion in Texas, because in California, as I recall the interview, there were over 500 regulations and a couple of dozen different regulatory agencies that all had to be dealt with just to get a restaurant open, right down to micromanaging the height and curve of the curb around the lawn in front of the restaurant. I mean, this just gets, to the level of ridiculousness, and it causes investors with capital to look elsewhere or to sit on the money. And that really is the underlying problem in this economy, is too much money is parked and inactive and timid.
Dan, I'd like to shift gears and talk politics in the time we have left. It looks like, at least preliminarily, it's going to be a tough year to be an incumbent. West Virginia, which admittedly does not have a love affair with President Obama, in the Democratic primary, I believe a convicted felon who was actually incarcerated in Texas took 41% of the vote. The same week, Senator Richard Lugar, a longtime Republican senator from Indiana, was defeated in the primary by a Tea Party candidate. There is apparently a lot of unrest among the electorate. How do you see this whole election thing playing out in November? Do you want to go out and make a prediction?
Well, if you set aside national polling and mood, which I think is very close to a 50-50 split, and there are scenarios, for example, at the presidential level where President Obama loses the popular vote but wins via Electoral College. At the state level and at the Senate and House of Representatives level, it may, in fact, be a difficult time for incumbents. I think if you look at the 5 to 7 key states likely to decide the election, and you look at polling data there, and you are a betting man, at least at the moment, you would find it very, very hard to bet on Romney. Personally, I don't think it's possible for him to win it. I think Obama has to find a way to lose it. In recent weeks, he has, it seems to me, been finding some ways to wound himself. with segments of the electorate, but still, if you were a betting person at the moment, you would be wagering on re-election. It's still a long time to November, but the advantages of the incumbency, the overall money advantage, which when you hear the Obama campaign whining that Romney has a money advantage, again, they've isolated a single statistic rather than looking at all the money available from PACs and unions and so forth, in which case there's probably a 4-to-1 money disadvantage for Romney. And 4-to-1 nationally is one thing, but in the latter months, when you are able to concentrate all of your spending into 3 or 4 critical states, a 4-to-1 advantage in local media and statewide media is almost insurmountable. And, you know, people need to remember, as they handicap this, that probably the last president who had the country in as much of an economic mess and malaise was Jimmy Carter, and it took a Ronald Reagan to beat Jimmy Carter. And so you can draw your own opinions about how close we are to having a Ronald Reagan running as the Republican nominee, but I don't think anybody would claim we're there. So I think this is a very difficult election for the Republicans, certainly at the presidential level.
Dan Kennedy, thank you for joining us today. Everything Financial Radio will return after these words.